And also, I know the schedule says State of CSS results, but to be honest, I didn't have time to finish the results yet. So instead, I hope it's okay if I explain a little bit about how the surveys work and kind of give a behind-the-scenes look at the surveys. So this is how it mostly works. And I live in Kyoto, and I run the State of CSS and State of JS developer surveys. So if you don't know them, they're developer surveys, and that's what they look like. So you have information about, salaries, experience, company size, and then information specific to if it's CSS, like CSS frameworks, or for JavaScript libraries, and so on. And you can check it out at stateofcss.com and stateofjs.com. So I want to start talking a little bit about the site generation itself. So if you use the static site generator like Gatsby, for example, which is the one we are using, the way it usually works is you have a lot of Markdown files or JavaScript files, and Gatsby will use your directory structure to create the site, to create the URLs, the route, and so on. But as you can see, we have a lot of different pages, right? And also, each page is very repetitive. We have blocks with charts. And so rather than have dozens or maybe even hundreds of separate HTML or Markdown files, instead, we are generating everything from one big YAML sitemap. And because we have a very, very repetitive block structure, each block is actually defined using a template, which is also another separate YAML file. And that template will specify which component to use for the block, and also how to load the data for that block using a GraphQL query. So by combining that, we can have a very, very simple way of declaring each block, very declarative, and create all the static pages required by the site. So I talked about GraphQL, and that brings me to the second item. Sorry, this is maybe a bit too long. Almost there. Yes. So data processing and loading. So the normal way I think of generating data for a survey, for survey results, would be to store data in a database and then run some kind of script on that data using maybe Python or R or some other language like that, and then outputting JSON files and then feeding those files to the charts. But that's not what we do. So the flexible dynamic way instead is to use GraphQL. And we have a fairly complex GraphQL API that lets you query for the data you need and even filter it. So filter by country or by age. And what's really cool is that every query will generate the data on the fly from the database. So this year, for example, we'll have this chart, which is the gender distribution for each country. And here it's filtered by country, but you could have the same chart filtered by age, filtered by company size, or any other parameter. And currently, those GraphQL queries happen at build time, so when the site is generated. But there's nothing preventing us from doing that at any time. So in the future, what we hope to achieve is having those static charts, but also inline in the results, letting you change the parameters and build your own queries, basically, and obtain any chart you want filtered by any other parameter. And that's only possible because we do have that live API, which processes data on the fly and not just static JSON files. Now, finally, the last thing I want to talk about is, yes, internationalization. So in order to reach as many people as we can, through the survey, it was important for us to internationalize it and translate it. And so the normal way would be to rely on a third-party platform like Transifex. But a lot of those platforms cost money. So what we did instead, the better way is to use GitHub, because GitHub is free and everybody already has an account. Everybody knows how it works. So all the translation strings are stored in YAML files. And those YAML files are then parsed using the GitHub API and put into the GraphQL API. So they're outputted through GraphQL. And this way, Gatsby or any other process can query for those strings the same way that it queries for the data. And so that system is not perfect. For example, there's no notifications when some strings change. So that's a hassle for the translators sometimes. But at least because it relies on GitHub and it's all open source, we can improve it. And who knows, maybe it will change someday, but for now it works well enough. So in conclusion, I think the normal way of doing things in like a real company would be to follow best practices. So look at how things were done in the past, try to find the best way to do things. Make sure you plan everything, make sure you have a roadmap, you know where you're going, and then rely on a very professional team of people who are used to work with each other to put everything together. And by contrast, the way the survey is managed is very DIY. So a lot of the solutions I just described are things I just came up on my own. I didn't really have time to look at what's been done before, and I didn't really have a lot of knowledge in those areas either. So I tried to do the best I could with what I had. It evolved in a very organic way. So instead of planning everything from the start, a lot of it evolved as the surveys themselves evolved and as the scope of the project grew larger. And then instead of relying on like a pre-made team, I'm actually the only member that's been constant since the start, and then everybody else comes and go depending on their availability, interest, so on. So it's a mix of, community contributions, open source, freelancers, consultants, depending on the funding we have. And sure, I mean, it's hard to work this way sometimes because you need a lot of management, and people are in different time zones and not always available. But on the other hand, it brings a lot of different perspectives to the project. And I think that's valuable. And that's also what made us able to kind of create these things that are different from the norm, from how other surveys are run. So in conclusion, thanks for listening to this short talk. Again, sorry for not having the results ready just yet, but hopefully they'll be ready in a couple weeks, let's say. And as you might imagine, a lot of this it relies on volunteers. So if you have the time, if you have the interest to help with either the translation or the code, well, do let me know. And even if you're a beginner, that's fine because, well, in a lot of these areas, so am I. Thanks again, and come say hello on Twitter if you're interested.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing this information. I didn't know how the state of JS and the state of CSS runs this way. And yeah, so this way it's pretty similar to OSS way. And so
Yeah.
everybody has different time zone, and yeah, but so everybody works very well. And I didn't know the state of JS uses GraphQL. So yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. So
Yeah, I don't think it's used that much for data processing or data. In this case, it's not the processing, it's just the querying the data, but I think it's a good way to get that dynamic API, which in the future will let people really kind of have a very granular view of the data.
Sounds so interesting. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. Yeah, and please come in next year. Yeah,
Yeah, I would love to.
yeah. Thanks. So yeah, okay. So see you again. Bye. And,